What if the one thing Iran trusted the most was the one thing that betrayed them first? For years, Iran believed its nuclear secret was buried too deep for anyone to touch. Before we go further, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, but it tells me you want more videos like this. Subscribe if you're new and send this to one person who still thinks this story is over, because it isn't. For almost 2 decades, Iran built something in silence. Not a city, not a weapon on display, a hidden ambition buried under mountains, wrapped in concrete, guarded by soldiers who didn't even know what they were protecting. The world called it a nuclear program. Iran called it energy research. But everyone who studied it closely knew the truth was somewhere in between, and that truth was terrifying. It started decades ago, quietly, in the deserts and mountains of Iran. Facilities went up in places most people had never heard of. Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, names that meant nothing to ordinary people, suddenly became the center of a global standoff. Underneath, these names were centrifuges, thousands of them, spinning day and night, turning ordinary uranium into something far more dangerous. Not power plant fuel, weapons-grade material. The world first learned about the scale of this program back in 2002 when an exiled opposition group revealed the existence of a secret facility at Natanz. Before that, most of the outside world had no idea how far Iran's nuclear ambitions had already progressed. Inspectors arrived, questions were asked, and Iran gave answers that satisfied almost nobody. From that moment on, this became one of the longest-running standoffs in modern diplomatic history. For years afterward, the world tried everything except force. Sanctions crushed Iran's economy, cutting off access to global banking, oil markets, and everyday trade. Negotiators spent countless hours in closed rooms trying to build a deal that could hold. In 2015, that deal finally arrived. A landmark agreement signed by major world powers promised to limit Iran's enrichment levels in exchange for relief from crushing sanctions. For a moment, it looked like diplomacy had actually won. That moment didn't last. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement, arguing it wasn't strict enough and didn't address Iran's missile program or its support for armed groups across the region. Sanctions returned, harder than before. And slowly, quietly, Iran's enrichment levels began climbing again. Each year, inspectors reported higher numbers. Each year, warnings from Western governments grew louder, and each year, almost nothing changed on the ground until it suddenly did. Diplomats tried again after 2018. Talks in Vienna dragged on for years, opening and closing without ever producing a new agreement. Every round of negotiations followed a similar pattern. Hope at the start, small progress in the middle, collapse near the end, usually over the same unresolved issues. Iran wanted guarantees that sanctions relief would last no matter who won the next American election. Western negotiators wanted stronger inspection rights and firm limits on enrichment. Neither side ever fully trusted the other enough to sign something permanent, and that lack of trust became the real engine driving this entire crisis forward. Here's the part that should stop you cold. To make a nuclear power plant work, you need uranium enriched to around 5%. That's it. Iran was enriching uranium to 60%. There is only one real reason to go that high, and it isn't electricity. Weapons-grade uranium starts around 90%, and 60% is not a technical accident, it's a countdown. Intelligence agencies across the world watched that number climb, and every time it climbed, the room got a little quieter and a little more nervous. For years, Iran insisted this program was peaceful. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency were allowed in sometimes. Other times, doors were closed, cameras were switched off, and inspectors were told to wait. Every time access was restricted, suspicion grew. If you have nothing to hide, why hide it? That question haunted every diplomatic meeting, every closed-door negotiation, every failed deal. Fordow was the site that worried people the most. It wasn't built on open ground. It was built inside a mountain dug nearly 90 meters underground, protected by layers of rock and reinforced concrete that no conventional missile could touch. Engineers didn't just build a facility there, they built a fortress designed with one purpose: to survive an attack. Iran wasn't hiding uranium in a warehouse. It was hiding it inside a mountain built like a bunker, betting that depth alone would keep it untouchable forever. That bet worked for a long time. Sanctions came and went. Negotiations rose and collapsed. Threats were made and quietly withdrawn. And through all of it, the enrichment never really stopped. It slowed sometimes. It sped up other times. But the direction never reversed. Every year, Iran moved a little closer to a line that the rest of the world was terrified of it crossing. Then came 2025, and the tension that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Israel struck first, hitting Iranian military and nuclear-linked targets in a campaign that shocked the region. Senior commanders were killed within hours. Air defense systems were targeted before Iran could even fully respond. Iran fired back with waves of missiles aimed directly at Israeli cities. The exchange escalated fast, faster than most analysts expected. Cities braced for impact. Air raid sirens became a nightly routine. And somewhere in Washington, a decision was being made that would change the entire story. The United States had watched from a distance for years, applying pressure, imposing sanctions, negotiating deals that never quite held. But watching from a distance stopped being an option. If Iran's most protected nuclear sites were left standing, no ceasefire, no treaty, no promise on paper would matter. The uranium would still be there. The centrifuges would still be spinning. The clock would still be ticking. So the United States chose to act directly, and what happened next became one of the most talked about military operations in recent history. It was called Operation Midnight Hammer, and the name fit perfectly. In the dead of night, American B-2 stealth bombers took off. Planes designed to slip through radar like they were never there at all. These aircraft flew for hours across the world, refueling mid-air, carrying a weapon most people had never heard of until that night. The GBU-57, also known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. A bomb built for one job only, punching through solid rock and concrete to reach targets buried so deep that ordinary weapons couldn't even scratch the surface. Picture the scale of this for a second. Each of these bombs weighs around 13,000 kilograms. They aren't dropped to explode on impact like a normal bomb. They're designed to bury themselves first, drilling through layer after layer of rock, and then detonate once they reach the target hidden underneath. It's not brute force, it's precision built for depth. And Fordow, the mountain fortress everyone believed was untouchable, was exactly the kind of target this weapon was made for. Alongside the bombers, American submarines launched cruise missiles at additional sites, hitting Natanz and Isfahan almost simultaneously. 3 of Iran's most important nuclear facilities were struck within the same operation. Not warnings, not symbolic gestures. Direct hits on the heart of the program Iran had spent decades protecting. The entire mission relied on secrecy so complete that even some senior officials in Washington reportedly weren't told the full plan until the bombers were already in the air. When the news broke, the world reacted in stages. First shock, then confusion, and then an avalanche of questions. Markets reacted almost instantly. Oil prices spiked as traders worried about Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that a huge share of the world's oil passes through every single day. Airlines rerouted flights away from the region. Embassies issued warnings. For a few tense days, it genuinely felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see whether this would spiral into something even larger. Allies reacted in very different ways too. Some European governments quietly welcomed the outcome, relieved that a program they had worried about for years had finally been dealt a real blow, even if they wouldn't say so loudly in public. Other nations condemned the strikes outright, warning that unilateral military action could set a dangerous precedent for how the world handles similar disputes in the future. Regional powers in the Gulf watched nervously from the sidelines, aware that any wider war could drag their own economies and security into the chaos, whether they wanted to be involved or not. Had Iran's nuclear ambitions actually been stopped, or had they simply been delayed? And the most important question of all, the one that would dominate headlines for months afterward. What happened to the uranium that was stored inside those sites before the strikes hit? If you're finding this story as wild as I did researching it, drop a comment with one word, hammer, so I know you're still with me. And if this is your first time here, subscribing means you won't miss what comes next, because the real twist in this story hasn't even started yet. In the days after the strikes, satellite images became the center of attention. Analysts around the world zoomed in on grainy photos, trying to piece together what had really happened underground, where cameras couldn't reach. What they found near Fordow raised eyebrows immediately. Rows of trucks lined up outside the facility, spotted in satellite imagery taken just before the strikes occurred. Trucks that seemed to be loading something, trucks that left the area before the bombs ever fell. This detail changed the entire conversation. If Iran had any warning, even a small window of time, moving highly enriched uranium wasn't difficult. It doesn't take an army to relocate it. A handful of trusted officials, a few reinforced containers, and a convoy leaving quietly at night could be enough to save a stockpile that took years to build. Was that exactly what happened? Nobody could say for certain, not at first. But the possibility alone was enough to keep intelligence agencies awake at night. American officials were divided almost immediately. Some declared the strikes had obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities, a word chosen for maximum impact, meant to project total success. Others, working quietly inside intelligence agencies, weren't nearly as confident. A leaked preliminary assessment suggested the damage, while severe, may not have destroyed the core of the program. Centrifuges could be replaced, facilities could be rebuilt, given enough time and money, and if the uranium itself had been moved before the strikes, then the most dangerous part of the equation, the material capable of becoming a weapon, might still exist somewhere else entirely. This is where the story stopped being simple. Governments love clean narratives, total victory, total defeat. But real conflicts rarely offer that kind of certainty. What the world got instead was a fog of competing claims, each side insisting their version was the truth. Iran claimed its program would continue regardless of the damage. American officials insisted the threat had been dramatically reduced. Independent analysts, the ones without political incentive to spin the story one way or another, urged caution, reminding everyone that a damaged program is not the same thing as a destroyed one. Weeks later, the International Atomic Energy Agency tried to get answers. Inspectors requested access to assess exactly how much enriched uranium remained and where. But by then, tracking it had become extraordinarily difficult. Some of it may have been buried under rubble, chemically altered or physically inaccessible after the strikes. Some of it may have survived intact, hidden somewhere entirely new. The uncomfortable truth is that nobody, not the United States, not Israel, not even the IAEA, could say with complete certainty where every gram of that uranium had ended up. Think about what that actually means. A nation stockpiled enough near weapons-grade material to build several nuclear devices. A massive, coordinated military operation was launched specifically to eliminate that material. And afterward, even with satellites in orbit and inspectors on the ground, the world still couldn't confirm exactly what remained. That's not a footnote in the story. That is the story. There's another detail that rarely gets enough attention. Enriched uranium doesn't need a factory to stay dangerous. Once it's produced, it can sit inside secure containers for years without losing its properties. It doesn't need electricity. It doesn't need constant maintenance. It just needs to stay hidden and protected from the outside world. That means even a small, quietly guarded storage site far away from any of the famous facility names everyone already knows could theoretically hold enough material to matter enormously in the future. Finding a hidden lab is hard. Finding a hidden container buried somewhere in a vast, mountainous country is exponentially harder. Let's pause here for a second, because this next part needs your full attention. Tap the like button if you're still watching. And let me know in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most so far, because what comes next is where things get even more complicated. Here's something most people miss when they hear about bunker-busting bombs and stealth bombers. Depth isn't the only form of protection. Time is protection too. Iran had years, maybe more than a decade, to plan for exactly this scenario. Anyone building a fortress that deep into a mountain understands that fortresses can eventually be breached. So the real question intelligent planners ask isn't how do we make this indestructible? It's what do we do the moment it becomes vulnerable? If Iran had contingency plans for moving material, the instant a strike seemed imminent, then the trucks spotted near Fordow weren't a coincidence. They were a plan executed exactly as designed. Some experts pushed back on this theory. They pointed out that moving highly enriched uranium isn't as simple as loading boxes onto a truck. The material has to be handled with extreme care, transported in specialized containers and moved without exposing workers to dangerous radiation. Doing all of that quickly, under the pressure of an imminent strike, would be an enormous logistical challenge. Others argued that a country that spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation would have rehearsed this scenario long before it ever became necessary. Both arguments have merit, and that's exactly why the story refuses to offer easy answers. The consequences of this operation reached well past Tehran and Washington. Every country watching this unfold learned something uncomfortable. Underground fortresses, no matter how deep, are no longer guaranteed safety. Weapons like the Massive Ordnance Penetrator changed the calculation for every nation trying to hide critical infrastructure beneath rock and concrete. If America could reach Fordow, other nations with similar ambitions had to start wondering if their own hidden facilities were truly as protected as they believed. But there's a second lesson buried inside this story, one that's arguably more important than the first. Military strength alone doesn't guarantee certainty. The United States used one of the most advanced weapon systems on the planet, deployed with incredible precision against a target years in the making. And even after all of that, the most basic question, where is the uranium now, remained unanswered for weeks, and some would argue remains only partially answered even today. Power can destroy buildings, power can collapse tunnels, but power cannot always guarantee the truth. There's also a human side to this story that gets lost in the talk of bombs and satellites. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians spent their entire careers building this program, generation after generation, often at great personal risk. Some of them didn't survive the campaign that led up to these strikes, targeted specifically because their expertise made them irreplaceable pieces of the puzzle. Losing infrastructure is one kind of setback. Losing the people who carry decades of specialized knowledge in their heads is an entirely different kind of loss, and it's one that no satellite image can ever fully measure. For Iran, the strikes represented a devastating blow, regardless of what ultimately happened to the uranium. Years of investment, infrastructure, expertise, and strategic planning were damaged in a single night. Even if some material survived, rebuilding enrichment capacity at that scale takes years, not months. Centrifuges are delicate, precision-engineered machines. Replacing thousands of them, restoring destroyed facilities, and doing it all while under intense international scrutiny is not something any nation can simply bounce back from overnight. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth that so many headlines missed in the rush to declare victory. Destroying infrastructure is not the same as destroying intent. A program can be set back by years and still exist in principle, waiting, adapting, rebuilding in the shadows, the same way it was originally built. Iran didn't create this nuclear program overnight, and one night of strikes, however historic, however precise, cannot erase decades of accumulated knowledge sitting in the minds of scientists and engineers who are still alive, still capable, and still motivated. This is the part of the story that rarely makes headlines because it doesn't offer a clean ending. It's easier to report that America destroyed Iran's nuclear threat than it is to explain the messy, uncertain reality that followed. The truth is layered. The strikes were real. The damage was real. The courage and precision required to pull off an operation like Midnight Hammer deserves recognition, but so does the uncertainty that followed it. Both things can be true at the same time, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to anyone trying to actually understand what happened. In the weeks after the strikes, world leaders scrambled to react. Some praised the operation as a necessary act of prevention, arguing that a nuclear-armed Iran was a risk the world simply couldn't afford to take. Others condemned it, warning that military strikes without a clear diplomatic follow-up plan could push Iran even closer to building a weapon in secret, out of pure defiance. The United Nations held emergency sessions. Regional neighbors quietly reinforced their own defenses, unsure of what might happen next. And ordinary people across the Middle East, the ones who have lived through decades of tension in this region, braced themselves once again for uncertainty. Inside Iran, the government publicly downplayed the damage, insisting the nation's nuclear knowledge and determination remained fully intact. Officials promised the program would continue, framing the strikes as an act of aggression rather than a moment of defeat. And whether that was genuine confidence or carefully managed messaging, nobody outside Iran's inner circle could say for sure. But one thing was clear. The strikes didn't produce a surrender. They produced defiance, wrapped in public statements designed to project strength no matter what had actually happened underground. So where does that leave us now? Somewhere between relief and unease. Relief, because one of the most dangerous nuclear programs on Earth suffered a serious, possibly historic setback. Unease, because the full truth about where Iran's enriched uranium actually ended up may never be fully confirmed. Intelligence agencies continue monitoring, satellites continue watching, and somewhere, quietly, engineers and officials on both sides are almost certainly already thinking about what comes next. There's a broader lesson here too, one that stretches far beyond this single conflict. Every nation watching this unfold, whether openly nuclear or quietly ambitious, took notes. Defense budgets around the world will likely shift because of this operation, with more money flowing toward deeper bunkers, better early warning systems, and faster methods of relocating sensitive material if a strike ever looks imminent. In a strange way, this operation may have just triggered the next generation of hiding, an evolution in secrecy that grows directly out of the very attack meant to expose it. If there's one thing this entire event proves, it's that in the modern world, secrets buried in mountains are never as safe as the people burying them believe. Technology keeps advancing. Bombs keep getting smarter. Satellites keep getting sharper. What felt untouchable a decade ago can become vulnerable overnight, the moment the right combination of intelligence, technology, and political will lines up. Iran believed depth was enough, concrete was enough, distance from prying eyes was enough. America proved, in one night, that none of those things are guarantees. They're just obstacles, and obstacles can be overcome by anyone determined enough to try. We're getting close to the end now, and this next part is the one that really changes how you look at the entire story. So stick with me for just a little longer. If you've made it this far, comment down below whether you think Iran actually moved that uranium in time, because I genuinely want to know what you think. But here's the deeper, more unsettling thought to sit with before this video ends. Even after being proven wrong, even after suffering one of the most significant strikes any nuclear program has ever faced, Iran's ambitions didn't simply vanish along with the rubble. Nations rarely give up long-held goals just because a plan gets interrupted. History shows the opposite pattern again and again. Setbacks often become motivation. Damage often becomes justification for rebuilding stronger, faster, and more secretly than before. Look at how other nations have responded to similar moments in history. Programs that were bombed, sanctioned, or sabotaged rarely disappeared completely. They went quiet. They moved underground, sometimes literally. They rebuilt using lessons learned from exactly what went wrong the first time. If Iran follows that same pattern, the next version of this program, whenever and wherever it emerges, will likely be harder to detect, harder to track, and even more deeply hidden than the one that just got hit. Iran isn't the first country to face this kind of decision, and it won't be the last. Other nations, over the decades, have quietly chosen to build weapons in secret precisely because they watched what happens to countries that negotiate openly and still end up targeted anyway. That's the uncomfortable lesson buried inside this entire saga. If openness invites suspicion, and suspicion eventually invites strikes, some governments may conclude that the safest path forward is even deeper secrecy, not less of it. That's not a comforting thought, but it might be the most realistic one. And that raises one final uncomfortable point worth sitting with. Every side in this conflict walked away believing they had accomplished something important. America proved its reach and its willingness to act decisively when diplomacy ran out of road. Israel proved that even a heavily defended, decades-old program could be forced onto the back foot within weeks. And Iran, whatever the true state of its uranium, proved to its own people and to the region that it could absorb a historic strike without collapsing. 3 very different versions of victory, all coming out of the same set of explosions. So the real question isn't whether the strikes worked. In a purely physical sense, they clearly did enormous damage. The real question is whether physical damage was ever going to be enough to end this story permanently. Uranium can be hidden. Facilities can be rebuilt. Scientists can start again. What cannot be so easily destroyed is the belief, held by a government for decades, that this program is worth any cost. And as long as that belief survives, buried deep in political will rather than deep in a mountain, the story of Iran's nuclear ambitions is far from finished. If this video pulled you in, this is the last favor I'll ask. Hit subscribe, hit like, and share this with someone who needs to understand this story the right way, because most coverage barely scratched the surface. America proved that no mountain is deep enough to guarantee safety forever, but Iran may have just proven something too, that even when the ground shakes, even when fortresses crack, and even when the world watches every move through satellites in the sky, intent is much harder to bomb than infrastructure. And that single fact might matter more than anything else this story revealed.